Institute of Risk Management, India affiliate presents National Resilience in the Age of Polycrisis, Talent, Strategy and the Future of Risk Management.
Every country has its breaking points. For some, it's the failure of a critical water system during a prolonged heat wave. For others, it's misinformation-fueled bank run that rapidly erodes consumer confidence and even financial stability. Somewhere else, it's a nationwide internet blackout that cripples access to healthcare, disrupts logistics networks, and even stalls public administration. And in another corner of the world, we have a stalled vaccination drive that reignites public health fears and even exposes governance fatigue. Now, individually, such disruptions may appear containable, but when they unfold concurrently or in close succession, their combined impact is exponentially greater. We are now navigating in an era where crises are no longer discrete or linear, but deeply interwoven and even self-amplifying. This emergent reality, increasingly characterized as a polycrisis, disrupts all the conventional models of risk mitigation. In such an environment, resilience is not just a recovery mechanism, it is a strategic capacity. It calls for anticipatory governance, multi-sector coordination, and even the ability to manage ambiguity at scale. And this demands a more integrated approach to risk management, one that bridges enterprise strategy, public policy, and even national security. So here's welcoming all of you to the panel discussion on national resilience in the age of polycrisis, talent, strategy, and the future of risk management by the Institute of Risk Management India affiliate. As the world's leading certifying body for IRM exams across 140 countries, the What's the Risk initiative underscores our unwavering commitment to driving thought leadership in every sector and discipline. Joining me in the 7th episode are Michelle Wucker, CEO, Grey Rhino & Company and Strategic Advisor to IRM India, Vishal Jain, Partner and Leader, Enterprise Risk at Deloitte India, and Pramit Pal Chaudhary, South Asia Head of the Eurasia Group. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Michelle, let's start with you. Your Grey Rhino framework has really helped leaders identify high-impact, high-probability risks. But in today's world of polycrisis, where multiple rhinos are charging at once, how should nations and institutions really prioritize what to tackle first?
Well, I was absolutely delighted to discover that the zoological word for a group of gray rhinos is a crash, which speaks specifically to this polycrisis idea. And gray rhinos are obviously about identifying obvious risks, but it's really even more so about taking a fresh look at obvious risks. Gray rhinos aren't only the ones that we misidentify, that we fail to respond to, but they're a reminder of how vulnerable leaders are to the obvious risks that we're usually not as good as we might think at responding to. So the first thing is to just go back to what you know already and make a list of the top 3 gray rhinos in that list. Look at how they affect your business, your constituency, and how are you responding? How could you better respond? And how are other stakeholders responding, whether that's competitors or other people, clients, citizens? It's really about response. Focus on the response and how you can respond better to this crash of gray rhinos in this polycrisis.
And is this something you've covered in some of your recent books?
Well, it's certainly in the Grey Rhino, and in You Are What You Risk, it talks about some of the often misunderstood influences on why some people, some leaders, some organizations respond more quickly and or others don't. It has to do with psychological factors, with cultural factors. So part of Grey Rhino theory is really understanding how you are prepared psychologically, organizationally, and culturally to respond to the obvious things in front of you. One of the most surprising discoveries for me was that many people find doing something to head off the gray rhino is a bigger risk than the gray rhino themselves. They would rather be wrong with everybody else rather than being right alone. But there's huge value to be created from recognizing obvious risks and being brutally honest about how you respond so that you can improve that response.
Vishal, let me bring you in at this point. What are some of the limitations that you're seeing in risk maturity across Indian enterprises, and where do we really stand today in terms of preparedness towards a polycrisis scenario?
So see, from a risk point of view, enterprises are looking and they have the risk registers in place, identifying what are the risks at all level, and largely it should be across, right from the localized micro level to the macro level risk also. But the thing is that the risk is in the current form today is more like a one-time assessment. So, and the preparedness is something not so much matured. So though I know what I am exposed to, but at the same time, my entire focus is more to mitigate that risk. The step beyond is that even if I mitigate, there could be even a very limited chance of risk getting actually, exploited or event happening it. But then preparedness from an event happening for a particular risk, I think that is a structured approach is still not that much matured in most of the enterprises. What they do is that everybody believes that we know how to do, what to do. We have been doing this for a while. So in a panic mode, everybody takes care of it. But then that at time of the crisis, you actually lose a lot of time if you're not structured in that process. The other thing is most of the functions or departments, they're working in silos or isolated, where when an event happens, it is across the company or enterprise. So an integrated view, checking what is the interdependency of one function to other function, the entire value chain based approach of the preparedness, if a crisis hits, how it's going to impact all the other components, that is something which is largely missing. And the last important is most of the focus has been on the localized because that is easily foreseeable in my environment. That's how people believe. What about the gradual, slightly longer, political, geopolitical, national, I would say a macro level risk? How much is the preparation for that is something which is, and sometimes not even thought also.
Pramit, bringing you in at this point, with global volatility escalating, whether it's geopolitical flashpoints or economic uncertainty and even supply chain tensions, how should India really frame its national risk priorities to stay resilient in this interconnected, turbulent landscape?
Well, I think the core of it remains what every government would like to do, which is to be completely self-reliant in as many elements as possible. That obviously that's not possible. There are limited resources. So the game really is to, one, assess your priorities on risk. You can't cover all risk. Governments simply cannot. Obviously, national security concerns tend to be predominant, but you'll see, for example, in India, the focus has been less on defense, but on diplomacy. Use a if you wish, less expensive mean to your security. Climate, for example, is a risk that is global, but very difficult to get solutions at the global level. So you attempt to carry out as much green transition as you can. You have supply chain risks. The Houthis attack American warships leave the Arabian Sea. The Indian Navy then has to step in to secure Arabian Sea, Persian Gulf supply chains, which strongly affect, obviously, Indian exports and shipping lines. So that cascade effect is there, but how does India handle it? A government, ultimately, especially one in a developing country like India, has limited resources. So the question for them is priorities and, should we say, strategies. So part of that is what India is doing. We're building 60 warships right now, the biggest naval maritime expansion in its history, because it realizes on the hard security side, it's largely going to be on its own. But on the other hand, it's forming alliances, should we say, coalitions of the willing in things like technology, strategic technology coalitions, for example, like the Quad. But it is also a member of the BRICS and emerging economies front organization to push certain issues in trade and climate, which fulfill its obligations. It maintains a relationship with all the great powers, even ones like China, in which it has a rivalry, but also one like Russia, which is a pariah to the West, but India feels it necessary for a larger Eurasian strategy. So the game, therefore, for India is getting these priorities right, and it's a perpetually shifting struggle to some degree for any government.
Michelle, building on that, let me come back to you before we take a short break. What role do you think can incentive structures really play across governments, markets, and even civil institutions to enable early response to systemic risks instead of really waiting for crisis to unfold?
When people talk about risk, they often only talk about the bad things, the things that you are preventing, whereas risk also involves opportunities. It's opportunities and vulnerabilities and dangers, and there is strategic value in addressing the vulnerabilities and building resilience. So I think what first needs to happen is a greater level of discussion at the board level, at the policy level, in the media, about resilience, what investments are being made in resilience, and then to build into key performance indicators, key risk indicators, and key resilience indicators as part of that. And we really need to talk a lot more about what's being done to prevent something. All too often, we see something like the Key Bridge collapse last year in Baltimore, and you probably saw the news recently of Mexican Navy training ship causing a lot of death and injuries by crashing into the Brooklyn Bridge. And in those cases, there were so many missed opportunities for preparation, whether it was in shoring up the Key Bridge, which would have cost a fraction of what it's cost to fix it, or in having the tugboat properly attached. So really talking ahead of time, what do we need to do, reporting on what you have done, and okay, if there is a failure, if it doesn't go properly, then you can always come back and say, we did everything we could. This was beyond what we did, but we were thinking about it. And that's a much better place for a policymaker, for a CEO, for anyone to be in than in the, oh, we saw something coming and we just let ourselves get trampled.
I think the common thread is clear that we need systems that can adapt and align, not just absorb the shock after they occur. All right, it's time for a short break. We'll be back with this powerful panel to unpack how talent, strategy, and even public leadership are converging to shape national resilience in a polycrisis world. Stay tuned.
Institute of Risk Management, India affiliate presents National Resilience in the Age of Polycrisis, Talent, Strategy and the Future of Risk Management. Institute of Risk Management, India affiliate presents National Resilience in the Age of Polycrisis, Talent, Strategy and the Future of Risk Management.
Welcome back to the 7th episode of IRM India's What's the Risk Initiative, National Resilience in the Age of Polycrisis, Talent, Strategy and the Future of Risk Management. I've been in conversation with Michelle Wucker, Vishal Jain and Pramit Pal Chaudhary. Vishal, coming to you, India builds on its G20 legacy now. So what's your view in preparing for the future in terms of the national risk priorities that organizations and enterprises need to have, ensuring that we're also looking at sustainability or geopolitical preparedness and even climate action failure?
Largely, whenever we have seen even the risk and the resilience related initiative, it's largely very inward looking for the within the company and the enterprise. I think when you talk about an ecosystem, an economy, or even at the national level or international level, I think more than doing an impact assessment, what the enterprises do to identify what is the critical department or critical process and different enablers for their operations, it is important to also assess the criticality of the enterprise for the larger ecosystem. Now, that is a very outward looking of it. So you are doing an impact analysis of yourself, that how much critical you are for that ecosystem or economy or from a national agenda point of view. And I don't think any organization would look from that perspective, because then you are contributing back. Because if the sector or the economy or the ecosystem gets disturbed, equilibrium gets disturbed, you are equally the impacted party, and you should not be the one who are impacting the equilibrium. So that's one aspect. Second is that the sectoral specific nuances are very different. So when we talk about the resilience and initiative or risk, there has to be a very sector level collaboration also. We are seeing regulations coming up in some of these sectors very clearly articulating and focusing on operational risk, operational resilience. But there are enough some of the other critical infrastructure sectors where I think this subject can be further emphasized on the subject of risk and resilience, where they should do something beyond what they are doing currently. So that's one. And third aspect is, especially if the enterprise, you have a global presence, then it's all the more, instead of looking how in each geography you are resilient, you have to see how the impact of one geography can lead to one. So one of the enterprise, I can say, when there was a geopolitical crisis in one part of the geography. They had their plant factory in, say, India. Though they were pretty secure from an operations point of view, but they were worried that because of that, there could be a cyber risk and the plant could get impacted because of the cyber attack coming, and because the company could be the target. Now that is the level of preparedness or which you have to see, which automatically takes your level, because then you are no more working in isolation. You are part of the ecosystem, you are part of the national infrastructure, and one last piece which I want to talk about in this is that each sector has a role to play for the other sector. So when there is a crisis in one sector, doesn't mean it is limited to that. Today, there are multiple sectors which might get impacted. So it is at that level. And that is the relationship and interlinkages which is critical to be formed.
So collaboration is the key across all the sectors.
Yes, sharing of critical risk or threats between the sectors and companies, that is important.
All right, Pramit, let's extend that view to the global playing field. With global alliances shifting and technological fragmentation accelerating, what should India prioritize to build strategic resilience, particularly in critical areas like semiconductors or energy security and even digital infrastructure?
What you need to do is, one, be able to guarantee that the supply chain, that you have enough friends in the supply chain that who are prepared to, if you wish, come to your defense if there's disruption. But the more important thing is to become a critical element of that supply chain yourself. In other words, India, for example, is dominant in chip design. We're the largest manpower source for chip design. We're trying to enter little bits and pieces of other areas, of particularly manpower training, thanks to a relationship we've developed with Taiwan. But the idea is that nobody can disrupt your supply chain without disrupting their own. So that's one way to handle it, become essential in that supply chain for anybody else. The other is to just become, and if you wish, to take an opportunity, which is what we're seeing with Apple and iPhone in India, where Apple is becoming increasingly nervous about trade friction between the US and China, and is developing, it's not pulling out of China, but it's developing an alternative. So you have a China plus strategy. Samsung has a Vietnam plus strategy. This gives India the opportunity to be able to come in and say, we can be that role, which means you get jobs, but it also makes you important again in a supply chain where you were basically just a consumer, and now you're essential to that supply chain, which then again makes other countries wary of disrupting you or prepared to work with you in certain ways because they want to make sure that their own supply chains are not in danger. There are areas of weakness that India is still working on, critical minerals. And I think there it's interesting to see how rapidly the government is trying at least to make itself important in critical minerals. So India has changed its main mining bill something like 5 times in just the past 3 or 4 years. It's reformed it again, tested, see whether it works. Finding, okay, we're not getting the investments we wanted, or we're getting feedback from mining companies, so we have to reform it one more time. And those reforms just keep coming. And that's a crucial part of now resilience for a lot of governments, is how you have to be more agile in terms of your own domestic regulations, rules and laws.
Michelle, looking forward, how do you think societies can really normalize long-term thinking and even risk literacy, not just during a crisis, but actually embedded as a cultural norm in leadership and in institutions? And it'll be great if you can also share what role can IRM as a professional body can play in the long-term resilience across the board.
Some cultures are more comfortable with long-term thinking than others, the United States being one that's less comfortable. Incentives in terms of political incentives, democracies have some trouble because they have such a short-term turnover of officials. I think it's important to depoliticize some of the risk literacy and the risk education functions. I love the idea of chief resilience officers, chief risk officers, but if you have governments that are changing so rapidly from one to others, that's not paying attention to past treaties, then obviously you need a societal function beyond government to help with risk literacy. In terms of incentives, you look at taxes. In the United States, our capital markets very much favor short-term decisions. both in the quarterly reportings, but also in the tax system that privileges secondary markets over bricks and mortar businesses. It's why you're starting to see a big movement into private markets. So I think looking at incentives from taxes to political terms to political insulation are all incredibly important. And there are some industries that are already suited to long-term thinking of ironically, fossil fuel, since they have long-term investments, but some of the long-term externalities that they've been creating have been a large problem. And organizations like the IRM are so important in helping to educate people at all levels. And risk literacy should be also about understanding thought processes, behaviors, not just some of the more traditional functions about, how much more likely is this than that? How much more likely you're to die in an airplane crash than in a car crash? It's about understanding our responses, our responsibilities, and putting in place the right incentives as well.
Great. Vishal, building on this forward-looking lens, what are some of the changes that you would advise in terms of the enterprise risk management frameworks to sustain in a world of polycrisis, whether it's the COSO, the ISO, or any other frameworks that you guys use in your consulting activity?
Let's stop using the word risk. Let's talk about resilience. Because the word risk itself is embedded in resilience. When you are resilient to a risk automatically. The resilience gives the positivity and that you are ready to withstand any impact which you want. So if you really ask me, that is the thought process. And bringing that, the mindset, as Michelle was mentioning, that we should, schools and education and everything talk about, because risk is a mindset. And that mindset and culture needs to be embedded in the organization, which takes to the next concept of on the enterprise risk management is the entire resilience by design or a risk by design concept, which means you are embedding that your strategy when you are identifying, developing your enterprise strategy or business strategy, you are embedding risk into your strategy. You don't have to wait and saying my strategy has a threat, but my strategy is ready with the risk components. And then we have other enablers and tools like artificial intelligence coming into the picture, Gen AI, which will help us to get some of the lead times, some AI-based crisis management, crisis simulations, which can be done based on the risk landscape which the companies have. So that can be leveraged a lot.
No, point well taken. Well, that brings us to the close of a truly insightful and forward-looking dialogue. I think today's conversation has made one thing abundantly clear. In an era defined by cascading risks and converging disruptions, as they spoke about, resilience can no longer be viewed as a reactive function. It must be embedded as a strategic imperative across governments, industry, and even civil society. And it's no longer about anticipating a single point of failure, but really preparing for the dynamic interplay of interlinked disruptions. And doing so requires not only institutional depth, but also leadership with foresight and the cultivation of talent capable in operating uncertainties. A sincere thank you to Michelle, Vishal, and Pramit for bringing such clarity and depth to this vital conversation on the future of national resilience in a polycrisis world. Stay tuned for the next episode of What's the Risk as we continue to explore the evolving landscape of enterprise and systemic resilience through ideas that really challenge, insights that inspire, and conversations that matter.
Institute of Risk Management, India affiliate presents National Resilience in the Age of Polycrisis, Talent, Strategy, and the Future of Risk Management.